you have no idea what COVID-19 is, I have to ask whether you've been living under a rock for the last year. COVID-19, coronavirus, the Rona, whatever you call it, has been plaguing the world since March of 2020 after an outbreak in Wuhan province, China. Since then, the world has been plunged into chaos as everyone tries to say COVID's safe. However, there is a small percentage of humanity who believe the current measures of COVID safety don't do anything, or those measures impede on their human rights, or that coronavirus is a meal in general. These people have been labelled the anti-maskers. Welcome back to Around the World in 600 Seconds, and today we're looking at being COVID safe versus being an anti-masker. COVID first appeared in Wuhan in the beginning of January of 2020. By the end of January, the United States had declared its first COVID case, and the World Health Organization declared a global health emergency days after that. Only 3 days later, the US declared its own public health emergency. By the 25th of February 2020, COVID is climbing closer towards earning a pandemic status, and on the 11th of March 2020, coronavirus is declared a pandemic. After that, most of the world was infected with COVID and went into lockdown. People only left home for work and necessities, millions lost their jobs, millions more were working through the dreaded Zoom. The world came to a screeching halt. In the first 6 months of the pandemic, the World Health Organization noted 30 million confirmed cases and over 1 million deaths. To put that in perspective, the amount of people who died is greater than the recorded population of Fiji. The amount of cases confirmed is larger than the current population of Yemen. And that's only in the first 6 months of their pandemic. We are nearly a year and a half down the line now. As of today, the number of deaths have doubled, reaching 3.5 million. That is the same number as Eritrea's population. Believe it or not, this isn't the first time coronavirus has been seen either. The first strains of coronavirus were actually discovered in the mid-1960s. As many specialists know, coronavirus is a cluster of similar viruses, with 7 of these viruses having the capability to infect humanity. This includes the type of coronavirus we've been seeing for the last year, SARS-CoV-2, and the various strains of this virus, including the British strain, the Indian strain, the Brazilian strain, and the South African strain. To understand how the strains work, we need to nerd out for a second. Corona is an RNA virus, much like HIV and influenza. In order to spread, COVID needs to copy itself to create more of the virus. So COVID uses an enzyme called polymerase to clone itself. However, these copies are not always perfect copies, and so the virus mutates into a new strain of the same virus. This is why different variants of COVID don't always respond to the same treatment. In case that's too hard to understand, I know I certainly struggled. Think of the Pokemon Mewtwo. The scientists wanted to bring the ancient Mew back to life from his recovered DNA, and in doing so, they created Mewtwo. While they share many similarities genetically, they still had drastic differences. Our current strains of coronavirus are exactly the same. I will be the first person to admit that anti-maskers may have a point if they actually used solid scientific arguments. People have done oxygenation readings with and without masks, showing that their blood O2 levels always read the same. People have demonstrated with slow motion how different types of masks stop saliva from travelling when sneezing. And the biggest argument, people have pulled up summaries from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to prove that wearing a mask doesn't impede on any of these so-called human rights. There are 30 universal human rights, none of which wearing a mask impedes on. In summary, these rights include: we are all born free and equal. Don't discriminate. We have the right to life. No slavery, no torture. You have rights no matter where you go. Everyone is equal before the law. Human rights are protected by law. No unfair detainment. The right to fair trial. Innocent until proven guilty. The right to privacy. Freedom to move. The right to seek a safe place to live. Right to nationality. Right to marriage and family. The right to own things. Freedom of thought. Freedom of expression. The right to public assembly. The right to democracy, social security, workers' rights, the right to play, food and shelter for all, right in education, copyright, fair and free world, responsibility, and nobody can take away your rights. Nowhere in that document says that being forced to wear a mask to protect everyone's safety will impede on anyone's human rights. Now, if the anti-maskers had a valid point with proven science, then maybe people would listen and say, now they have a point. But until that day, anti-maskers will be nothing more than a joke to society. So, whose side are you on? Are you saying COVID's safe until the pandemic is over? Or are you never donning a face mask again? This has been Round the World in 600 Seconds. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week.
Right here has become the most divisive thing on the earth right now.
I've got to put my 16-year-old son with a face covering on? I don't think so.
That's what America is all about. It's all about individualism.
When something is being imposed by the government, that touches deep feelings about individual freedom that roots in some of the founding ideas of the United States.
Mask or no mask? It's an argument Americans have been having since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Most doctors and scientists insist masks prevent the spread of the virus, but some politicians and citizens remain skeptical. And while this fight feels new, it's actually not. Something similar happened 100 years ago.
The history of mask wearing really begins in the second wave of the 1918 influenza pandemic. And so that's the deadliest wave. It's the fall wave. That's really when mask orders and even recommendations to wear masks starts to take off.
Wearing masks became a common practice among surgeons in Europe in the late 1800s, where doctors wore them to protect themselves from patients' respiratory droplets. The 1918 to 1919 flu pandemic took that practice outside of the operating room for the first time. It was the most deadly flu outbreak in history. At least 50 million people died worldwide, with around 675,000 deaths in the US. During this time, masks were recommended in Northeast cities, but mask wearing in public was mandatory in Western cities like San Francisco, Seattle, and Denver.
The typical mask was a surgical mask of the time, which was made out of 4, sometimes 6 plies of surgical gauze. It was pretty porous material. These were manufactured by a number of companies. They were also made by a bunch of Red Cross volunteers across the nation. But in many cases, the ordinance didn't stipulate what type of mask had to be worn. It just had to be a face covering, similar to what we see today. Chiffon face masks were made, for example, for the more fashion-conscious people. There were definitely significant numbers of people who pushed back and who refused to wear their masks, or who were caught without masks temporarily, perhaps letting it dangle or removing it, taking it down to take a bite to eat or something like that. And we have reports from pretty much every city that issued these mandatory mask orders of, in some cases, hundreds of people being arrested. San Francisco is a prime example of that. The city police chief had to notify the health officer and the mayor that they needed to stop enforcing the mandatory mask ordinance because his jail cells were filling up with people who were caught without their masks as they were awaiting arraignment before a judge.
For some residents, San Francisco's requirement to wear a mask was so unpopular that in 1919, a group of dissidents decided to organize.
So at least 2,000 people meet in January of 1919 to form the Anti-Mask League. And they have this mass protest, this rally inside of an auditorium where they listen to speeches from prominent physicians about why masks are not effective, from legal experts who say that it's unconstitutional, and just from people who believe that the government doesn't have a right to tell them what to do. We see not only several prominent physicians, but one of the members of the County Board of Supervisors is actually part of this Anti-Mask League. So these are quite prominent people in the community.
As new cases continued to decline and opposition to mask wearing increased, the officials of San Francisco ended mandatory mask wearing in February of 1919.
People are sick, people are dying.
I'm an American, and I feel like I should be able to do what I want to.
But while Americans bickered, Asian countries, including Japan, were quick to adopt mask wearing.
The Japanese in 1918, 1920, when the pandemic was raging around the world, were unusually enthusiastic about cosmopolitan ideas. The mask came to the Japanese public at that time not simply as an imposition of the government, but as a sign of modernity. By the post-World War II years, in the 60s in particular, the Japanese government is saying, no, it's more important for you to get your vaccine. But people clung to mask wearing. So at a certain point, the mask seems to have broken free from particular, public health initiatives and become something about personal space, about style even. And the term in Japanese for wearing a mask, call it a sort of a chic mask or a mask for style.
In Japan today, wearing masks is pretty common in winter to protect against the flu and in spring against pollen hay fever. Japan has had one of the lowest COVID-19 mortality rates of developed nations. Many believe it's because in Japan, it is perfectly normal to wear a mask.
The custom of wearing masks has spread with very little encouragement from the government. It's just being taken for granted that it was a sensible protective measure.
I think that we need to get past that rugged American individualism in this pandemic because we're all in this together. It's not just about protecting yourself, it's about protecting all of society.